The TiVA indicators shed light on the origins of value added in exports and final demand, and they can be used to then help answer critical questions about economic dependencies and the drivers of production. This is increasingly relevant as countries across the world seek to strengthen supply chain resilience in response to global supply shocks. Beyond trade, should say the ICIO framework has other uses as well. It now contains employment indicators that, for example, highlight how foreign demand shapes domestic jobs by workforce characteristics. It can also support analysis of greenhouse gas emissions that are embodied in international trade and final domestic demand, as well as the impacts of carbon border adjustments. By mapping the complex web of interdependencies across industries and countries, the database helps identify vulnerabilities and strengths in national innovation systems. And this evidence base underpins the OECD's work in advising governments on strategies to enhance adaptability, promote technology diffusion, and build resilient economies that can better withstand a variety of shocks, whether from pandemics, geopolitical tensions, or rapid technological change. This year's release also benefits from strengthened collaboration with a number of international partners, including the European Union, the IMF, the Asian Development Bank, UN ICLAC, UNICA, and the WTO, all of whom worked with us on focusing on harmonizing methodologies and building capacity for multi-country input-output analysis. And again, none of this would have been possible without dedicated efforts of national statistical offices in countries represented around the table and over the internet. And of course, across our teams here from the STI Directorate, as well as from TAD, the Trade and Agriculture Directorate, and from the Statistics and Data Directorate, I think all of whom are joining in today's release. Our joint work across directorates helps ensure the integrity, the depth, and the breadth of the data that now underpin a wide range of policy and research applications of ICIO-TiVA. So to all potential users, whether seasoned analysts or newcomers to this data set, we hope that these updated resources will spark new insights, support evidence-based policymaking for a more resilient and sustainable global economy. And I thank you again for joining us today. And I'd like to now turn over to my good colleague, Marion Jansen, who will, from the director, from the Trade and Agriculture Directorate, who is going to also offer opening remarks. So Marion, over to you.
Thank you, Jerry. And what a pity for me not to be there in person, but thank you for allowing me to say a few words for this at the opening of this session. And I will speak as representative of a big user group of the ICIO-TiVA data, maybe the Trade and Agriculture Directorate, and through that directorate, the Trade Committee is one of the most important users of the ICIO-TiVA tables. And we are, of course, using these data for our work on supply chain trade. And in recent years, with the high frequency of shocks and changes we have been seeing, the demand for these data has only gone up, and we therefore very much welcome today's release of a new vintage of data. We will use this data not for our analysis of supply chain trade, supply chain resilience, but we also work with your team, Jerry, and with SDD on developing annex data sets or satellite data sets, extended data sets. I do not know what the official data name now is. We work with your teams on producing trade and value added data in constant prices. This is, of course, very important in a period where inflation is starting to play a more important role again. We work together on using this data to understand how much production, how much value produced in domestic economies is produced by foreign multinational enterprises or by domestic multinational enterprises. And we did recently release an approach to measure trade and value added for services trade. And that's, for the experts in the room, quite an innovation, because it is not easy to measure services trade with traditional trade statistics. So being able to do this with the TiVA data set, that's a real step forward. We look forward to discovering this new vintage of TiVA data, and I look forward to the presentation. Thank you all and have a good meeting.
Thank you, Marion. Thank you, Jerry. I'm Guy Lalande, the acting head of the Productivity, Innovation and Entrepreneurship Division, and I will chair the rest of this event. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Norihiko Yamano, economist, leader on the construction of the ICIO tables, to present the new vintage of ICIO and TiVA indicators.
Thank you very much. So my name is Norihiko Yamano. I'm going to talk about the new vintage of OECD Inter-Country Input system and the trading value-added indicators. We put our team members here, and this is going to be also working together with different directorates in OECD, and as mentioned from the cooperation from the other institutions in the world. Okay, so this is already covered a bit. So what's new since 2023 edition? So first, we now can cover the post-pandemic period of 2021-2022. So it's going to be really interesting. And also we had to revise some more numbers for the year 2020 because there were many statistical issues in the 2020 when we estimated that number into years ago. And also we tried to expand the industry details from 45 to 50 sectors, mainly focus on some of the energy and the carbon intensive sectors. For example, agriculture, individual mining sectors, quarrying sectors, and the basic metals, that's steel and non-ferrous. Those are very important individual sectors to analyze certain policy areas such as carbon and energy footprint analysis. So, and also, of course, as mentioned earlier, that this is also important sectors for the supply chain resiliency issues. And also, we try to cover the more countries, especially for the natural resource rich countries in the Africa and the Middle East. So, okay. So since early 1990s, we've been developing the different indicators based on the multi-country input-output system. From early 2010s, we now have more focus on the indicators like trading value-added, jobs sustained by foreign demand, and the other issues such as carbon footprint issues. And also we cover many countries so that we now can analyze more analysis based on the regions, not just the individual countries. And also this way we can have more analysis on the resilience in the production networks, and the other new indicators are coming in the last few years, such as the indicators listed here that shows how the individual economies production networks depends on the foreign intermediate and the specific production hubs. So also the data has really increased since the beginning. So in the earliest TiVA estimates that was in 2013, 40 countries, 3 years, 80 industries. Now the dimensions really increased, the double size of the countries, 28 years, and the 50 industries. Okay, so these are sort of classic ideas about how to use the TiVA indicators. There are 3 to 4 main indicator groups. So first one is value-added contents in gross exports. So we can see in the backward linkage way to understand the global value chains, to understand the upstream countries' involvement for the individual economies exports. And also we can see the domestic value-added contents in the foreign final demand. So those are all the foreign export. That's a way to understand the forward linkage way to see the participation of the economies. And then we can see the direct involvement of the service economies into the global value chains. Those are usually indirectly embodied in the manufacturing goods. And understanding this, we can have a better understanding of the economic measurement in each country. And then we have more complex data, like the true origin of the import contents. So for example, some of the domestic value-added initially exported may be imported in the embodied in the import product. And also we have the indicators on final destination of the gross export. Those are processed in the immediate importers. So those are some ideas about how we can use the TiVA indicators. Okay. So where to find the this indicator? We now have an updated website. If you go to these links in English or French, there is information on the trading value-added website. Then that includes the sources and method and documentation. The country notes are forthcoming. We are finalizing the text for key economies. And then the, of course, the database links are there as well. And then if you click the data access, you go to our data portal called OECD Data Explorer. And then there are a new indicator set for 5 set of indicators in the Data Explorer. And this is how the forthcoming country notes look like. So this time we focus on the TiVA indicators with some additional charts using the true origin of imports and the final destination of the gross exports. And those will be available, should be soon. And also we will show you some key result using the latest result. So basically the stories until 2019, 2020 are the same from the past TiVA indicators, but it just to mention that the last time we were saying that the globalization may be flat or the slow variation. Because, but yeah, if you look at the latest 2 years, 2021 and 2022, this foreign linkage is really increased in many countries. And that is due to many factors such as the increased price, recovery of the post-COVID time, and also war in the Eastern European country. So that's also all presented in these indicators. And also, if you look at the individual countries, we can also still see the foreign value-added contents of the manufacturing gross exports are important in many medium and small size economies. Okay. And also this a little complex chart shows how the individual sectors, we mentioned that the detailed sectors we focus this time is contributing to the domestic final demand. So it shows the sort of energy and the food security issues as well as carbon footprint indicators. So this database is used in multiple directorates at the OECD from our directorates to the different policy areas. And also, of course, by many institutions around the world. So before we open up the questions, let us just answer some of the frequently asked questions. So there are three main questions always. One is, can we get more detailed industries, more timely estimates, more countries? We're trying to work on this, and also different directorates at the OECD are trying to answer these questions and to have a more timely estimates, more different way of presenting the ICIO, and also trying to have more countries in the different countries. So for the next steps, as mentioned, we are trying to finalize the country notes, and also trying to include more indicators involved in the this ICIO database, like trading employment, and also trading employment by workforce characteristics, such as age and gender issues, and the greenhouse gas footprint that will be also presented in the later this month in the OECD's COP30 virtual pavilion. And we will have more analysis on the non-resident expenditure, focusing on the tourism activities, and also trying to improve the programming and data collection architecture so that towards timely indicators, we would like to continue to do this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nori. And before I open the floor for questions, let me remind you that this is a hybrid event, and we have around 130 attendees online. So for those in the room, if you wish to ask questions, you can use your microphone to speak. For those online, you have several possibilities. You can use the Q&A feature in Zoom. You can use the chat, or you can raise your hand, and the technical team will assist you in enabling your microphone. So that being said, I'm now opening the floor for questions. Okay. Come on, don't be shy. Any question for Nori? Okay. So if there are no questions, I suppose Nori's presentation was super clear. And I am now honored to welcome online our distinguished keynote speaker, Robert Koopman. He is currently Hearst Senior Professional Lecturer at the American University in Washington, D.C., and Editor-in-Chief of the Global Value Chain Development Report. Prior to that, he was the WTO Chief Economist and Director of the Economic Research and Statistics Division. He holds a PhD in economics from Boston College. Professor Koopman, the floor is yours for approximately 15 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. I presume you can hear me just fine?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And really, congratulations to the OECD team for this timely update of the TiVA database. And particularly thank you, Jerry and Marion and Nori, for your kind invitation. I have some idea of the tremendous work that goes into building and maintaining these databases and the effort required to produce the latest inter-country input-output tables and the TiVA indicators. So it's a real pleasure to join you here to celebrate what I think of as one of the great collective achievements of international economic measurement. When I first became involved in the value-added trade analysis, the goal was simple but ambitious: to see globalization as it actually operates, through networks of production, not through the misleading lens of gross imports and exports. I think the story of TiVA really begins with a series of breakthroughs in the late 1990s and early 2000s. In 2001, Hummel's Ishii and Yi gave us the first formal measure of vertical specialization. They showed that a growing share of world trade consists of goods that cross borders multiple times before final use. And their insight was that trade statistics double count value whenever intermediate goods move back and forth across borders. A few years later, colleagues Wang Zhu and Shengjin Wei and I extended that logic. In the AER and later in the Journal of Development Economics, we developed what later became known as the Koopman, Wang, and Wei decomposition. And Xi and Shengjin continue to work on these kinds of decompositions. The KWW method allowed us to break down domestic exports into the foreign and domestic value-added components and to separate the double-counted portions explicitly. And it was the first time we could quantify how much of a country's exports were truly its own value-added and how much simply passed through. This work was done while I was at the USITC, and it helped explain how China's early export surge largely reflected assembly of imported components. And this finding, by the way, at first met pretty significant skepticism from policymakers, but it soon proved pretty valuable to them as they realized they needed to better understand how global production networks operated. Now, at the same time that Zhi Wang and Shengjin and I were working, Robert Jansen and Guillermo Noguero published their theory of trade in tasks and value-added trade balances, making it possible to align the decomposition with macro entities. And I think together, these advances set the conceptual foundation for the TiVA framework that OECD and at that time the WTO would soon build. By the late 2010s, the need for a consistent global data had become pretty urgent. At the WTO, where I was then chief economist in 2014, we were constantly confronted with questions that gross trade data could not answer. How global are supply chains really? Which economies are the true beneficiaries of exports? How exposed are countries to foreign demand and foreign inputs? Traditional trade statistics, while still very important, and national input-output tables were no longer enough. We needed the multi-country tables that stitch these economies together in this consistent accounting framework. Around 2010, 2011, prior to my arrival at the WTO, and under Director General Pascal Lamy, they created the Made in World initiative. The OECD and WTO began a collaboration that culminated in the first TiVA release. That collaboration was largely motivated by the growing understanding among policymakers that global trade was far more complex than simple bilateral trade flows. The original OECD WTO database built directly on the theoretical work I mentioned, but it also drew from pioneering datasets like the World Input-Output Database, WIOD, and early efforts by IDE-JETRO and the Asian Development Bank. The construction of these databases are not easy. There are a myriad of intellectual and data challenges to aligning industry classifications, reconciling trade asymmetries. I think I saw some questions in the chat coming up as I started about how we deal with some of these things, and then getting input, output, and or supply use tables updates in a timely fashion. In addition, there are resource constraints, as these databases are human capital intensive exercises in an era largely defined by analytical austerity. However, the goal was never just to publish another data set. It was really to help reframe how we think about globalization itself. When the first TiVA database was released in 2013, the world finally had a way to see globalization geometry. Instead of national exports, we could trace value chains. Instead of bilateral trade balances, we could measure true exposure. Instead of talking about who sells to whom, we could ask who creates the value. That revolution reshaped academic and policy discussions alike. For example, using TiVA, we learned that about 1/3 of the value of China's exports was actually foreign, mostly coming from East Asian partners. We could decompose the German car, the iPhone, or the Korean semiconductor into their value chain components. But more than descriptive power, TiVA provided analytical rigor. It offered a consistent accounting system linking production, consumption, and trade in a single matrix. And that's an enormous technical achievement. And it became a public good, a shared empirical foundation for hundreds of papers from productivity spillovers to carbon footprints. The regular updates and expansion of the database that Nori just mentioned are critically important for researchers and policymakers, particularly now. Timeliness and coverage matter. As the TiVA framework matured, the OECD ICIO team, led by Nori and his colleagues, took it further, linking the trade and production data to activities of multinational enterprises, the AMNE database. That linkage allowed us to see ownership structures, foreign affiliate production, and the geography of corporate control layered on top of value-added flows. It meant we could ask new questions. Who actually controls the value chains? How do investment decisions shape trade dependencies? And how does foreign direct investment redistribute production networks globally? These extensions transformed TiVA from a database into a platform for analyzing the entire architecture of globalization, trade, investment, and production as a unified system. I believe the timing of this launch is especially meaningful. We're living through a period when globalization itself is being questioned. Sometimes it's proclaimed as dead, and as Nori's data demonstrates, it actually is not dead. It may have been in a coma or sleeping. But I actually think with the latest data, we see a rebirth of globalization. Actually, I call it a rewiring or a reorganization of globalization. Production networks are adapting to new technological, geopolitical, and environmental realities. And I believe that in this environment, the TiVA framework becomes even more valuable. It gives us empirical grounding amid political rhetoric. It allows us to distinguish resilience from retreat, diversification from decoupling, and efficiency from vulnerability. A draft paper I recently presented at the International Input-Output Association argued that we are moving from the balance sheet era of input-output analysis to an increasingly network topology era, one where strategic interdependence and systemic fragility are central. In that framework, TiVA data provides the empirical backbone for measuring economic centrality, choke points, and spillover propagation. An excellent example of the methodological innovation on top of the TiVA work is that of Satoshi Inamata and Misa Hanaka on pass-through frequency. They use the inter-country I/O tables to measure how frequently and how far shocks pass through global production networks. I think the PTF metric moves us beyond static measures of participation towards a dynamic understanding of transmission. For instance, when a semiconductor shortage or an export restriction on critical minerals occurs, the PTF can help us not only see which sectors are affected, but how short or long those supply chains are and how deeply those effects might propagate. This kind of analysis is invaluable for policymakers managing supply chain risk or assessing economic security. I think that in many ways, the PTF exemplifies a new generation of TiVA-based research, one that blends economic structure, network theory, and strategic policy analysis. And it shows that TiVA is not only a statistical tool, it's a living laboratory for understanding complex interdependence. That said, there are challenges ahead. None of this is easy. Maintaining and updating the TiVA database requires extraordinary collaboration and resources. Every vintage means reconciling national accounts, balancing trade asymmetries, and ensuring methodological consistency across time and countries. One ongoing challenge is coverage, particularly for developing economies in Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Latin America. And the successful WTO, OECD, UNICA, Africa TiVA data effort, which ended a couple of years ago and resulted in 5 additional African countries being included in TiVA, is a good example of joint efforts to expand this coverage. Nori mentioned how large and how cooperative the effort was in producing this updated TiVA database. So inclusion matters not only for completeness, but for policy relevance. Many of these economies are deeply integrated through commodities, services, and labor remittances, and channels that are often underrepresented in current input-output frameworks. Another challenge is the timeliness. In an age of near real-time data and rapid supply chain reconfiguration, a 3 or 4 year lag can feel like a lifetime. Yet, we must balance that speed of updating with quality, and the integrity of the TiVA depends on rigorous reconciliation. Finally, there's the integration challenge, bringing together trading goods, services, digital flows, and intangible assets. The boundaries between these categories are blurring. Digital platforms, intellectual property, and data services are now fundamental production inputs, still only partly visible in today's data, and capturing them will be a key task ahead. So let me say a few words about how the TiVA data is shaping our ongoing research in the Global Value Chain Development Report 2025, which I have the honor to edit together with colleagues from the WTO, Asia Development Bank, IDE JETRO, and with contributions from some staff at OECD, IMF, World Bank, and working under the auspices of the University of International Business Economics in Beijing. This is the 5th report in a series. The 2025 report looks at what we call reglobalization, the reorganization of production networks in response to technological change, geopolitical realignment, and sustainability imperatives. Using TiVA and related databases, we examine how countries are diversifying suppliers, reshoring strategic segments, and building redundancy into critical supply chains. We also are able to observe that many Latin American countries and many African countries have been relatively slow at expanding their integration, and that those regions so far must take further steps to get better integrated into this realigning global economy, and the realignment provides them with potential opportunities. One striking insight from this work is that while gross trade may appear to slow, value-added interdependence remains robust, as we saw in Nori's presentation, even intensifying in some sectors. In other words, the wiring of the global economy is changing, but the current still flows, and TiVA is what allows us to see that current. We're also using TiVA to quantify how new industrial policies, like those aimed at green technologies, semiconductors, electronic vehicles, are reshaping cross-border production linkages. These policies don't simply shift trade volumes, they reconfigure network topology, and TiVA helps us map those shifts empirically. So why does all this matter? Because measurement changes how we think. When we began decomposing gross exports into value added, it forced economies and policymakers alike to reconsider what exports, imports, and competitiveness actually mean. That same spirit of intellectual humility and empirical curiosity is what continues to make TiVA essential today. In the current geoeconomic context, characterized by strategic rivalry, technological competition, and efforts at selective decoupling, accurate, transparent, and comparable data are not luxuries, they're prerequisites for rational policy. TiVA gives us a common language to discuss interdependence without ideology. It reminds us that even when politics divide, production connects. It shows that resilience and openness are not opposites but complements, and that understanding the structure of global value chains is key to navigating both prosperity and security. So in closing, as we celebrate this new TiVA vintage, I want to take a moment to acknowledge some of the community that made it possible. The OECD's ICIO teams have done extraordinary technical work. Marion, her predecessor Ken Ash, Jerry, and his predecessor Andy Wyckoff, and OECD colleagues I've worked with over the years, such as Sebastian Mirabeau and Nadam Ahmed, have championed TiVA's policy relevance. In the early years, the WTO team of Patrick Lowe, Hubert Escape, and Christophe Degaine ensured that WTO members would benefit from TiVA's insights. And there's a broader network from the WIOD Group, Asia Development Bank, IDE JETRO, UNCTAD, IORA, and many national offices that continue to sustain this truly public good. The task ahead is not just to maintain TiVA, but to keep it alive, to expand, innovate, and integrate. We should think of it not as a static data set, but as a strategic observatory of globalization. Every update, every refinement, every methodological advance brings us closer to understanding how the world's economic fabric is woven and how it can be re-woven when shocks occur. Let me end with a simple thought. When Leontia first developed input-output analysis, it was a wartime tool designed to allocate resources efficiently under constraint. Today, our constraints are different. Our goal is the same, to use economic measurement for human insight and collective progress. TiVA embodies that spirit, rigorous, cooperative, forward-looking. So really, congratulations to everybody involved in this release. And thank you for allowing me to share in the celebration. And thank you for ensuring that even in uncertain times, that the measurement of globalization remains a beacon of clarity and collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Koopman. I will open the floor for questions. And perhaps while you are preparing your questions for Professor Koopman, I will try to summarize the questions, the deluge of questions we received for Nori online. So the first question was if you could provide a layman explanation of what the TiVA data show beyond what the gross data on trade show us, but I think Professor Koopman already did a good job in explaining that. So perhaps we can answer the other questions. What are the improved assumptions in this new vintage of TiVA? Some participants also notice significant revisions for the 2020 data. What countries, what industries are driving these revisions? And finally, a few questions on the release of the trade and employment database, as well as the foreign input reliance, foreign market reliance, and foreign production exposure indicators.
Okay. Thank you for questions. So yes, let's talk about the assumptions we had to make this time. So there is a famous technical assumption called proportionality assumptions. There are different ways of saying that the import penetration rate could be same for all sectors, or the trade partners proportionality assumptions, and the assumptions for making the products for the different, for example, export destinations. They are all proportionality assumptions. But especially the first one I discussed, the import proportionality is, I think, the key numbers we are usually working on. But it's true that we still use similar assumptions, but this time we are now able to understand more of what is the remaining, which is a domestic use, taxes, and the distribution services. So all these components are now improved with my colleagues to better allocate this non-imports part. So eventually, I think it is improved in that sense. For the additional TiVA related indicators, such as FIR, PTF that mentioned earlier, those may not be available soon in the Data Explorer platform because they require the additional country dimension or industry sector definitions. But for sure, we will put those key numbers in the website, or the how do you call the bulk download of the indicators from the website. So those will be available to you. And also same for the trading employment. And this will be available, should be next month for the key numbers. I'm looking at my colleagues, but yes, it should be for at least for the first set of the indicators. And then why 2020 numbers are so different? I think there are many reasons. One, of course, is it was a COVID time, so that many countries struggle to how to present the huge subsidies or income flow. So those are the issues. And then the first, including many OECD countries, they put in the different locations of the subsidies was by sectoral net operating surplus for certain transportation service sectors. So those are the things we didn't see in 2020, but I mean 2023, but now we saw the more definitive numbers there. And also we start seeing more use tables, SUTs, and import tables. Those additional tables are especially now available from the EU countries. So we are able to better present the re-exports. And that's why we may see some differences from the past export numbers. Okay, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Nori. We have two more questions online that I will read. Perhaps I will ask Professor Koopman to try to address those two questions. And Nori, if you want, you can add something afterwards. So the first question is from Der Pilat and asking what the latest data show about the impact of the COVID crisis on value chains. And the second question by Satoshi Namata, whose work was acknowledged during your presentation. How would you envisage the possibility of using generative AI or AI in the construction of ICIOs? Professor Koopman, do you want to answer those questions?
Thank you, Chair. Sure. So I think what COVID showed us about value chains is that they're really resilient and they're critical, right? So during COVID, the transportation and logistics sector and distributed manufacturing around the world, while occasionally creating significant choke points in certain products, actually facilitated the recovery from COVID and the sustenance of a reasonably normal lifestyle in many countries. At that time, I was actually working with a WTO, WHO, IMF, World Bank vaccine supply chain effort. And much of that was very product specific and much more granular than what we see in the TiVA data. But what was really quite amazing was the ability of the private sector to adapt to the supply chain constraints and find ways to solve problems. Many of the problems that they had to solve were policy problems. And by the way, this touches a little bit maybe on Satoshi's question. So I think the bottom line is that COVID demonstrated that supply chains and global value chains are both a solution to resilience, but also identify potential choke points. And the TiVA data can actually help us identify strategically, looking ahead, where are there these potential choke points that we might then think about, this is an area where we need more resilience. How this touches on Satoshi's question is increasingly, and in May, I had the great pleasure of attending what was then called a SPIN network meeting that Marion Jansen's team put together. And we saw examples of much more granular supply chain and value chain analysis. In many cases, the application of AI on product-specific databases. And I think this is going to be one of the bigger challenges going forward is, can we find ways to bring more granular data and matching as much as possible things like transaction level data and domestic production and consumption survey data into a more granular mapping of both international and domestic supply chains. And I think AI potentially is going to help us with that. I'm not sure. There's lots of uncertainty around AI. But I think we saw that COVID tested global supply chains. They weren't perfect. But they did help with the recovery. They did help with the production and distribution of a critical vaccine. And we also saw that post-COVID, that global supply chains re-energized. Now, I do think they are reorganizing and they're rewiring. And you can see large demand centers like the United States becoming a smaller share of global trade, both as it aims to either reshore or friendshore or reduce its dependence on trade. Mapping these things through something like the TiVA database is very critical to understand whether or not the policies are working. But I do think we need this more granular approach at some point. We need to find a way to merge these approaches. And I think AI may help us do that kind of merging. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Koopman. Nori, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that's already mentioned. So just what we found from the COVID side. So in after 2021, it's actually post-COVID. It's really, as I mentioned, change the structure with the value-added components. It's not just a total TiVA. So if you look at the wage of the different industries, many industries really increased the wage, and especially the operating surplus. So we have to also estimate more granular in terms of value-added components. It can, I think, better understand the activities happen there. But after 2023, that's what we are working on. We now see more normalized phase. So in 2020, in the next version, we will see more closer to the normal time. And also for the generative AI, we've been using sort of a machine language technique to understand what was happening from the data sources we collected for SUTs, like what we did before with the person who is in touch now. So yes, and I think we could say it was a small language model, but maybe we could do more on using the larger language model to expand the coverage.
Thank you, Nori. Are there further questions in the room or online? No. So then we will transition into the last sessions of today's event, where panelists will be invited to share their experience using ICIO tables and TiVA indicators and how they can be used to inform policy making and the functioning of global production networks. So we have two panelists for this session, Rebecca Freeman, senior economist at the Bank of England, and Bernhard Michel, a senior analyst at the Federal Planning Bureau of Belgium. And Bernhard is also the chair of the OECD's expert group on accounting frameworks for measuring economic globalization, EGMEG. Let me start with Rebecca. Rebecca, can you tell us about the research that the Bank of England has been carried out using ICIO-TiVA data?
Yes, let me just share my screen here. All right, can you see it?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you so much again for inviting me to participate here as a panelist. And like Bob, I'm very honored to be able to kind of share my insights into the TiVA database and participate in this event. So I wanted to start my intervention today by first highlighting that TiVA and ICIO are truly invaluable public goods. This has been said already, but I wanted to think about this a bit more deeply by taking a walk down memory lane to the very first database launch in 2013. And at the time, the OECD's former Secretary General already acknowledged that conventional trade statistics might not be telling us the whole story. And as we've heard today, that's because traditional trade statistics only map the last stage in bilateral transactions rather than the direct and indirect ways in which goods and services travel globally before reaching their final destination. So in his report to ministers in 2013, he noted that TiVA had already begun to revolutionize our understanding of what's going on in global trade and investment and production patterns. So importantly, the ICIO data also sparked the development of new indicators by the research community. Bob mentioned many authors and economists who have come up and devised ways to measure and trace out global supply chains. And this led to the development of all of these new and innovative ways to decompose value-added trade flows across countries and sectors. So many of these indicators have been incorporated into the TiVA database. Nori, for example, talked about backward linkages, but what the TiVA database does is make them extremely accessible and basically click and play. So it's easy to say that TiVA is really a true success story, and it quickly became, the word TiVA became a buzzword in policy circles with very little need to convince policymakers about why TiVA statistics matter. So the next point I'd like to highlight is that TiVA is also an evolving public good. And in particular, as the rhetoric around GVCs has changed, TiVA and the ICIO tables have also evolved accordingly. So in the 1990s and early 2000s, as we've already heard today, when TiVA was in its conception stages, GVCs were largely seen as being productive. Participation in them was good. It was a way for countries to boost their development status. And accordingly, the main TiVA indicators in the original vintages appropriately focused on value-added trade to tease out where the work was actually done. But as we all know, we're living in a time of increasing global shocks with things like pandemics and geoeconomic tensions, climate disasters, digital disruptions, etc. And these shocks have become increasingly systemic in nature, affecting many sectors and markets simultaneously. So therefore, in particular, as the COVID pandemic was under tow and manufacturing sectors globally were shutting down, GVC links were largely seen as vulnerable, and integration into GVCs was seen as a source of exposure to global shocks. So kind of noting that shocks disrupt the entire shipment value of goods, not just the value added in the very country that's being disrupted, the focus in policy discourse kind of shifted back to gross trade and a desire within the kind of framework and space of GVC thinking to think about who is sending what to whom. And in response to this, the OECD made several measures of gross output flows in GVCs publicly available. There was a question already in the chat about it today. And several of these have been based on work of mine that have been completed also with Richard Baldwin from IMD and Angelos Theodorakopoulos from Aston Business School. And there's 8 of them, including their decompositions overall, which are included in the OECD webpage. And then the next couple of slides, I'm going to focus on just 2 of them. And these are the foreign production exposure import side, or FPEM, and foreign production and exposure export side, or FPEX indicators. So what do these tell us? FPEM is telling us how exposed an importing nation is to foreign versus domestic inputs. And FPEX is telling us how dependent an exporting nation is on input sales to foreign versus domestic partners. And importantly, these are available for all sectors in all countries, as well as various sector groups like total manufacturing or total services. So the core FPEM and FPEX indicators present what we call in our work look-through links. So that comprises both direct and indirect links between country sectors. And they're also decomposed into face value or direct and hidden exposure or indirect components. And this is particularly important because it can help policymakers understand where their hidden exposures to shocks might lie. So Bob in his talk mentioned this in the form of choke points. So for the rest of the talk, focus on just a couple of policy applications of how the indicators have been used at the Bank of England in my own research as well as avenues for analysis. So the first of these are two charts which are drawn from a Bank of England quarterly bulletin article, which was meant to paint a portrait of the UK's global supply chain exposure. So here, using the indicator to shed light on the question, who is your top supplier of inputs? And specifically, this is looking at the share of UK manufacturing sectors for which the top input supplier is Germany, the US, China, or some other country. And the left two bars are showing the split for face value or direct links in 1995 and 2020. And the right two bars are showing the split for the total look-through, meaning the direct and indirect links in the same years. So what messages are popping out? So if we look just at the face value bar for 2020, we see that on this face value basis, the US was a top supplier to 40% of manufacturing sectors in 2020, and China was a top supplier to. But if we move over to the right-hand side of the chart, which accounts for the direct and the indirect connections, China, in fact, we see was the top supplier to over half of UK manufacturing sectors. So the main punchline here is that the UK has a large hidden exposure with China, and this comes through Chinese inputs, which are embedded in intermediates sourced from other countries, in particular the US. So next, I'm going to jump over to the export side. And for this one, we use the FPEX indicator to help us decipher the top destination of UK inputs. And specifically what we're doing is we're plotting the share of UK manufacturing sectors for which the top input destination is either Germany, the US, China, Ireland, or any other country. And like before, the left two bars look at face value links only. The right two bars are showing the look-through links. And what do we see? So when we look at the face value statistics alone, we see that actually Ireland was a top destination for only one UK manufacturing sector's inputs in 1995 versus 40% in 2020. But on the other hand, when we move over to this look-through basis, we see that Ireland was a top destination for just two of those UK manufacturing sector's inputs. And instead, the US, which is in orange, was a top destination for 80%. So again, what's the main punchline? Well, the UK's largest exposure on the sales side is with the US, and that's primarily via direct sales to Ireland. So that's it for the graphs because time is short, but I wanted to close by talking through some additional ways in which the TiVA and ICIO data can be applied to policy analysis, some of these avenues which have been explored as well within the Bank of England. So first, kind of the main TiVA indicators are very helpful in understanding country services content of manufacturing. So this became extremely important during the pandemic, in particular as manufacturing sectors were shutting down globally, country by country. So the UK, which is a services-based economy, became quite concerned about how this was going to impact their economy. And it was very important to understand what the ripple effects of manufacturing shutdowns into services sectors might be. Another thing that we can think of is about decoupling and shock transmission. So for example, indicators like FPEX and FPEM or their value-added equivalents can provide first order approximation of how much output or how much GDP might vanish if bilateral trade relationships were to dissolve. And also, very importantly, combining ICIO structures with general equilibrium model, we can study in a much more formal way how shocks transmit through GVCs, as well as things like trade deflection. We can also think about mapping GVCs, and the TiVA and gross output indicators can help us answer questions about how much trade is flowing through connector countries, for example, and that's important in a time of heightened geopolitical tensions, or how much of a country's own domestic value added is embedded in bilateral trade between two different partners completely. Fourth, we can also use ICIO structures combined with tariff data at the granular level to help us understand how tariffs get amplified through global value chains and what the response of trade is to these indirect trade barriers. And this is particularly important because tariffs get repeated when inputs are crossing borders multiple times, as has been pointed out by OECD colleagues, for example, Sebastian Mirdot. So, of course, this is not in the least a comprehensive list beyond all the developments already highlighted today and many more. The OECD uses the ICIO data to publish their own indicators on CO2 emissions, the role of multinationals. We've talked about trade and employment, etc. But these were just some of the key points that I wanted to highlight. So I will stop it here and say thank you once again for inviting me to join as a panelist.
Thank you, Rebecca. Let me now ask Bernhard to explain the use of ICIO and TiVA in the Belgian context.
Okay, thank you, Guy, and hello to everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Not yet. We can see it now.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you and hello to everyone, and thank you to the organizers for having me here as panelist in this launch event of the new vintage of the ICIO-TiVA database. It is very much an honor, especially as I am more coming from the statistical side, as a at least part-time statistical producer, and from that side, it is clear that the TiVA ICIO database is not only a very, very useful analytical tool, but it is also a very interesting statistical tool. I'll say a few words on this, but I want to start off by taking the opportunity to acknowledge the enormous work of all those who contribute to the construction of this great data set. In first instance, this is the team around Nori, Colin, Agnes, and all the others who have been mentioned on Nori's slide. And it also includes those working, for example, on the multinational enterprise extension of the data, which is also a very, very useful tool. So thank you to all of you for building this database, and I would encourage personally the OECD to keep up the effort in the future. The tool is clearly very useful, and we cherish it also from the statistical side. That being said, I first want to share a few thoughts in terms of the statistical perspective, and that is the perspective of a statistical producer in line with my work as a statistician.
Bernhard,
yes.
We are sharing your slides, so when you
okay.
move to the next slide, please tell us.
Well, you can now move to the next slide. Thank you, Guy. I didn't know that. Okay, yeah. Well, and this is in line, the statistical perspective is really in line with my work as a statistical producer, contributing to the construction of Belgium's input-output tables. These tables are published by my institute, the Belgian Federal Planning Bureau, and they are used as an input in the construction of the ICIOs. Well, the inclusion of our data from a statistical perspective is really a motivation and has become an important aspect of our statistical work. It also gives visibility to our statistical work in the sense that the very large take-up of the ICIOs and TiVA indicators contributes to promoting the kind of statistics we produce at the national level, increasing our visibility at the national level as well. Moreover, we have, in order to feed more detailed and more extensive national data, we've actually extended our production of national tables annually, so that well, more data on Belgium can be included into the global tables of the OECD and others. And of course, we are very much looking for feedback on our countries in terms of our national statistical output, in terms of the widespread use of the TiVA database. In that context, I want to provide some shameless publicity for the expert group on measuring economic globalization, which has its place in this context as well, and which I have the honor of chairing for the moment. I'm particularly pleased that the OECD has set up this expert group recently, because it provides a very interesting forum for exchange between the OECD and delegates from member states, be it from national statistical institutes or other national institutions. Well, the idea is really that the OECD and its work on globalization can be shared and exposed to national delegates, and that the OECD can get feedback from national delegates, and it provides a forum for discussion on methodological issues, which is also very valuable to both parties, I think. In terms of extra work of this group, there is also a form of exchange on good practice, and an endeavor to provide guidance. For the moment, part of the group is working on re-exports. This issue has been mentioned previously, also by Nori. This is also an important feature which can influence TiVA and ICIO statistics. And for the moment, there is work going on. With regard to this expert group, any contribution from national delegates is, of course, most welcome, which would bring us further in these methodological discussions. So far for the statistical side, my work is not limited only. Can we go one slide further, please? My work is not only limited to producing statistics that then feed into the ICIO tables, but I'm also using, for part of my analytical work, I'm a regular user of ICIO-TiVA data. Mostly, well, I'll be trying to give two examples in that respect, but well, the general trend is that what we do is to combine more detailed or specific national information for Belgium that we have at our disposal, to combine this with the global perspective of the ICIOs. So really look at the GBC integration with respect to the more detailed national data that we have. In the past, we've been doing that type of work for Belgium with respect to footprint calculations, also regional data. But what I want to focus in my first example, is really the extended input-output tables, as they're called, and what we have been doing there. What are extended input-output tables? Well, the underlying idea of extended input-output tables is to split or disaggregate industries in the traditional tables, not into a more granular industry classification, but rather by firm type, so as to be able to account for firm heterogeneity within industries. This is, from a statistical point of view, a challenge. The OECD has recently published a handbook that tries to provide guidance to producers of such tables. We've been doing this work for Belgium for several types of firm heterogeneity, exporter status, ownership, firm size, and the idea is to get a better information or a feel for the importance of different types of firms within the economy and within its structure. We've done so in particular more recently for a disaggregation with respect to firm size. Can we go one slide further, please? Thank you. And well, we've split industries into three types of firms. Three types of firm size classes, that is to say, large firms, which are above a EU-wide defined threshold, And then we have two types of small and medium-sized enterprises. Genuine SMEs, those are sort of standalone small and medium-sized enterprises, and pseudo SMEs, which are firms which are small and medium-sized enterprises which are part of a larger group, and we consider those as being different from these genuine SMEs. Based on the tables where we have split the industries according to these categories, we can see the shares of these different types of firms and their economy-wide importance. That is what is shown on the left-hand side of the graph, or the left side graph, sorry. The other firm category in yellow is just industries you cannot disaggregate. For example, public administration is not to be disaggregated by firm size, of course. You can see that genuine SMEs, for example, make for a quarter of value added and a third of employment, but only a fifth of exports. The shares of large firms in light blue and the shares of pseudo SMEs is larger in exports. Another feature which we can identify from those data is, for example, within manufacturing value added, and that is the right-hand side graph. Within manufacturing value added, large firms account for a much larger share within high-tech industries. Again, in light blue, you can see this, this very large share of large firms, while genuine SMEs in orange are account for more of low-tech value added in manufacturing. These statistics are interesting per se, and can we go one slide further, please? But with respect to the ICIO tables and the possibility of linking up things within global value chains, we went one step further, and we basically included or plugged our size extended tables into the ICIOs to look at, well, contributions to Belgium's GVC participation from these different types of firms. And that's what is shown in this graph, where you can see that in terms of the backward GVC integration and the forward GVC integration, they make different contributions. On the one hand, large firms account for the largest chunk of backward GVC integration, whereas genuine SMEs, those standalone SMEs, actually account for a much larger share in forward GVC integration, where it comes to providing inputs for exports. This is just one of the possibilities we have with respect to the integration of those size extended input-output tables into the ICIO. Many more possibilities to calculate other indicators. Can we go one slide further? My second example goes a bit into the direction of what Rebecca has mentioned as well. And here I've been trying to look at shifts in imports. This is related to the foreign exposure story that Rebecca has been very prominent in bringing forward with input-output data. We've been doing that type of calculations for Belgium just to check, but we've been trying to push things a bit further in a slightly different direction, in line with a discussion around the reallocation of US imports away from China to other sources. There are quite a few academic publications out there, I just quote two of them here, that bring evidence from merchandise trade statistics on this issue. This allows them to have a very granular take on the question, but it limits their analysis to only direct imports. And so based on the latest OECD ICIO-TiVA data, that is to say the one that is being, the vintage that is launched here today, but it is already available since a few weeks, I've been trying to look at gross imports and value-added embodied in imports to give a bit of more flesh to that story, and then try to look at what is happening for other countries. For my case, it is of particular importance to look at what is happening for Belgium, but I can understand that this is not the main focal point for most of you. So I've been including a few other OECD countries as well. Can we go one slide further? So when we look at gross exports, which can be looked at on the basis of the OECD's ICIO tables, I've computed the share of China in US gross imports, manufacturing for the period 2007 to 2022, and in the orange line shows you the share of China in gross imports. You can see an increase, a steady increase up to 2015, and then some ups and downs, but a general downward trend. This is in line with what is shown in most of the academic papers that use merchandise trade statistics. When you compute value added embodied in gross exports and you compute the share of China in US imports, well, in the value added embodied in US gross imports, well, what you see is the same type of upward trend up to 2014, 2015, then ups and downs, but a relatively stable profile. So, and the difference between the value added embodied in gross, the Chinese share in value added embodied in gross exports and the Chinese share in gross US imports is actually starting to increase in the last few years. So this is probably in line with the story suggested by the academic papers that the Chinese value added may still be ending up in US imports, but being channeled through other countries. For us, as I said, the focal point is more Belgium. Can we go one slide further, please? So what I've done is I've computed the same statistics here in orange, again, for gross imports, and in blue for value added embodied in gross imports, always the Chinese share in imports of those countries. I've done this for Belgium, Germany, Japan, and France, and you can see that the stories are widely different, or at least the impression you get from the pure calculation of what you see for 2007 to 2022 is widely different from the US story, except maybe for France. And you see increases, you see relatively large differences, and you see for Japan that the share is much, much bigger, but the relationship between gross imports and value added embodied in gross imports is the other way around. So you can see a lot of stories here. I'm just giving this to you in terms of food for thought, and to show you also that there is a lot in this OECD ICIO-TiVA database, which can be analyzed and which can answer questions which are out there in terms of academic research and policy. A lot more to be done here, for sure. We are at the start of our analysis in that respect, and we'll be continuing. Maybe others will be interested as well. I guess I'm largely over time. I will stop here. And well, one last slide. Can you go one slide further, please? Thank you all. Thank you for having me as a panelist here, and thank you to the producers again. It is a great database, this ICIO-TiVA database. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernhard. Yes, we can. Of course. I'll now open the floor for questions to Rebecca and Bernhard. Perhaps while the audience is preparing the questions, let me ask you my question. What would be, according to you, the most pressing and perhaps also the most relevant extensions you would like to see in the ICIO-TiVA world? Who wants to start?
I'm happy to start, but I think that Nori has already alluded to the answer in terms of his frequently asked questions. So The most pressing for me would be sector disaggregation and the kind of timeliness of the data. So in particular, with regards to the sector disaggregation, it's very important for policymakers, for example, to understand granular trade relationships. And as geopolitics and tensions worldwide have been mounting, there's many policymakers who are focused on things like rare earths or other, products, specifically, for example, semiconductors. And so to the extent that we could use the input-output tables, even alongside traditional trade statistics, to be able to kind of allude to answers to some of these questions about vulnerabilities, I believe that would be very important. And this launch already kind of takes a nice step in that direction by adding additional sector detail, but kind of going further, that would be kind of one important thing that I can think of immediately. Also being able to combine these, as Bernhard has just mentioned, with country-specific input-output tables, even if that's not possible for all countries, given that different countries have different statistical practices. Maybe we could get at that for individual countries that have kind of more developed national statistics available. And with regards to the timeliness of the data, obviously policymakers always want a question answered yesterday. So to the extent that data can be updated frequently, such that these questions and time series can be extended, I think this is very important.
Thank you, Rebecca. Bernhard.
Thank you, Guy. Well, just a few comments from the statistician in terms of the timeliness. I mean, the timeliness is, of course, from a policy perspective, a huge issue. From the perspective of the statistician, timeliness is a huge problem, in the sense that already as things stand now, we're struggling to get the data out in the timing that is foreseen for the data, because at least at the national level, this type of data requires huge efforts and huge amounts of input data to be reconciled, to be balanced, and this is quite some statistical work. So it's not only bringing those national statistics together; it is also producing the national statistics. In terms of the initial question asked by Guy, I would, well, in line with my presentation, I would really be very much in favor of having extended the so-called extended IO tables to some extent. The OECD is producing that. The team around Sébastien Miroudot, Carmen, and Mattia is doing that type of work, and this is very, very, very important in my view. We have this for multinationals. I would have certain ideas on how to go further for multinationals as well, but without wanting to push them. On the other hand, things like firm size classes or exporter or trader status would also be very, very useful and interesting extensions.
Thank you, Bernhard. I will one last time open the floor for questions in the room or online. No. So we are almost reaching the end of this event. I would like to seize this opportunity to thank all the speakers, the audience, and the team for their hard work on the data and indicators, and also the technical team, Jennifer and Shai, for the preparation of this event. And I'll now give the floor to Monica Brezzi, Deputy Director at the OECD Statistics and Data Directorate, for some closing remarks.
Many thanks, Guy. Good afternoon, colleagues and delegates. It's a real pleasure to close today's launch. And first of all, I'd like to thank our speakers and panelists for their insight and for sharing their expertise so generously. And many thanks also to all the participants for your participation and questions, but also more generally for your continued engagement with this important work. I think I don't need to summarize today's discussion, but I would like to take a few minutes to highlight three main takeaways. My first point is on the statistical infrastructure. We have seen today that the inter-country input-output tables and the TiVA indicators have become part of the core statistical infrastructure that national administrations, OECD and international organizations and the research community rely on. So they provide a unique, coherent framework to analyze how economies are interconnected through global production and trade. And we have come a long way since the first TiVA publication in 2013, as Professor Koopman has eloquently reminded us on the foundational work of TiVA in providing a better understanding of globalization. The ICIO infrastructure now covers over 80 economies and 50 economic activities, up from the 64 economies and 34 industries or 40 economies at the very beginning and 34 industries. Methodological refinements and innovation have also been a major achievement. As you know, developing ICIO involves filling data gaps, integrating national supply and use tables with international trade statistics, reconciling different classifications, currency, reporting practices, and then resolving any inconsistencies in the data. So as we have heard, it's a highly complex, technical, and very importantly, collaborative effort that relies heavily on the coverage and quality of the underlying national statistics. Therefore, also the importance for us to continue to invest in enhancing comparability, coverage, and quality of those national statistics, the national accounts, the supply use tables, merchandise trade, etc. Since this methodological effort may go unnoticed when we look at the finished ICIO table, I also want to join all the speakers in thanking the TiVA team, in particular Nori, Colin, and the rest of the team for their outstanding work, technical excellence, and the persistence required to deliver such an ambitious product. My second takeaway of today's discussion is about the breadth of analysis that TiVA allows. And today's presentations have shown that TiVA indicators, moving from gross trade figures to measuring the value added that is created and the exchange across borders, have become key tools for understanding the complexities of international trade relations. So they allow us to assess supply chains resilience, as highlighted also in the latest OECD Resilience in Supply Chains review. Rebecca Freeman discussed how these indicators, tools were used to better understand how global shocks propagate through trade and production networks. Bernhard pointed out about using this framework for countries to deepen their own analysis with extended input-output tables, integrating firm size breakdowns, and looking at the shifts in sourcing pattern within the EU. But we know that many researchers, and were mentioned in Nori's presentation, have drawn on TiVA indicators to map global value chains in critical goods, analyze the diffusion of technology innovation across border, and understand the exposure of economies to different foreign inputs. Furthermore, it has been mentioned that the use of the input-output tables and TiVA go far beyond the trade analysis. They have become the empirical background for a wide range of analysis and feed directly into debates on resilient and sustainable growth, on industrial policies, trade and employment, innovation, and fair transitions. Finally, my third and final point is obviously on what to do next, our continuous improvements, the breadth of users and uses for analysis to support policymaking of ICIO and TiVA indicators is a testament to their relevance, but also adds complexity that was mentioned by our panelists. Put it simply, it means to find a balance between relevance of indicators for different policy purposes and maintaining the quality, integrity, and coherence of the data. So enhanced international collaboration and regular dialogues among statisticians, researchers, and policy communities obviously helps to find this balance. In this context, the discussion of today, and even importantly, the expert group on measuring the globalization chaired by Bernhard and Michel, which will meet in a couple in 3 weeks at the OECD. It's a valuable forum for national experts to exchange experience and strengthen collaboration, consistency, and mutual learning across countries. So when we look ahead, we will continue to refine methodologies to be able to respond to emerging policy demands, as we have heard today. And also we will continue to make TiVA indicators as granular, timely, accessible as possible to policymakers, researchers, and the public, being aware and acknowledging the trade-off that these requests imply. On this point, on the timeliness, I'm also pleased to announce that the OECD will release nowcast for a selected subset of indicators for the year 2023 and 2024 in a couple of weeks. These estimates will cover a selected number of countries, so 41 countries and 21 sectors, and will build on the latest TiVA vintage, the one presented today. And we believe that these type of estimates can play a useful role in bridging the gap between detailed data releases. And finally, we will continue to strengthen our partnership with other international organizations and with national statistical offices to ensure that TiVA remains at the forefront of trade and globalization analysis. So in conclusion, as global trade and production continue to evolve, the need for accurate, timely, and internationally comparable data has never been greater. TiVA provides exactly that foundation. So we hope that you will continue to make full use of this data to inform your analysis and policy discussions. And we look forward to your feedback as we continue to improve them. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a pleasant evening.
I think with that, we're adjourned. Thank you again for joining us off today and for the great work on TiVA. And we hope to see it put to very good use across many, many different communities. Have a good afternoon.